And I am live. Well, hello everyone. This is Mark Turi again for my Saturday evening live. And as always, I just want to remind you, please, to like this video if you haven't already, and please subscribe to my channel. If you also haven't already, if you're watching this on the replay, or if you've come to my channel from a YouTube search or something, please consider subscribing. I'm only at 130 subscribers right now. And of course, I would like to get more. Yeah, to this week, I think we're going to have an interesting um, topic because we're going to talk about the 1848 revolution, which is also called the Spring of Nations. But of course, and as always, before I get into that, I wanted to go through some small talk and some introduction. But I haven't been doing much in the way of, I basically came back from London. It was a week on yesterday, so a week Friday, and that was the what was that? That was the 15th. So in the past week, I have basically just been writing a lot from my thesis. And I guess a couple days ago on Thursday or something, it was snowing here where I live in Budapest. And, it doesn't snow very much here. It doesn't snow very often here, but it snowed pretty, pretty intensely. I woke up to snow. So as a Canadian, I actually do not like snow and I do not like the cold weather at all. And so it's always funny here, even though we get only a little bit of it, I still hate it. However, today was around 4 degrees Celsius and sunny, which is around, I'd say, probably around 40 degrees Fahrenheit-ish. And then, of course, the lows are they're getting pretty cold. They're getting to be around 0, so the low 30s for our American friends. And yeah, we're getting some cold weather. It's interesting how our summer was so hot, and now our winter so far and the fall have been hot. Actually, it was pretty hot last month, but now we're getting into some actual winter weather. I just had a couple star comments here. First of all, so Pete, he says, can't participate tonight because he's got another slideshow. Don't worry if you're on the replay crew. Again, please like and subscribe. And never an issue, of course. If you can't make a live, just comment again, and we'll see you. Hopefully, see you on Wednesday, and if not next week. And of course, Irish Mart is here. Irish Mart, how are you? Glad you're here. I hope you enjoy today's presentation. It's about a very interesting and often underknown or almost unknown event in history that I think some more Europeans and probably Germans and Hungarians and people who live on in the European continent will probably know more than some people who live especially in North and South America, because I remember like completely not learning this when I was growing up in Canada, but then only learned about it when I started living in Europe, especially in Germany. And it's also really, really important here in Hungary, and I'll get to that, of course, when I get into the slides. But I really don't have too much as far as small talk is concerned, because I really have not done that much this week, other than working ahead on my thesis and doing more research, doing readings. I had a couple meetings earlier in the week, which actually were really nice. But I've basically been inside my apartment because it's been cold, and I haven't really been wanting to get out, to be honest with you. Me and the cold, or the cold and I, and the snow and I do not get along. As I like to say, it knows what it did. We had a blizzard back in 1994 in Toronto, and then El Nino in 1998. And the actual snow was around 6 feet high. So just under 2 meters of snow, maybe 1.9 meters of snow. And when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, every single winter had tons and tons of snow. We had, a below Celsius, below zero temperatures. When I was a kid, the coldest temperature I remember living through was minus 27 degrees Celsius, which is not fun when you are a kid and you have to stand outside waiting for the bus to pick you up to go to school. And then when you have to go outside for recess, because recess, which is only 15 minutes, 15 minutes is nothing when you're an adult, of course. It is absolute an eternity when you are a kid. And of course, I think we had a half an hour for lunch, or lunch recess was a half an hour. We ate for half an hour. We had a half an hour for, for lunch recess. And I mean, whoa, not fun. I just am not a fan of snow. So there you go. And the cold, not my thing. I'm also not a fan, by the way, of the opposite, because I've been in horrible, humid, and hot temperatures in places like Las Vegas and Florida and Australia, and not for me. Speaking of Clearwater, here's Clearwater Chad, Buffalo. We're talking about snow, Chad, and how awful and cold it is. I hope it's okay in Buffalo. I know you guys get hit like with unbelievable amounts of snow, and I know that, of course, because I think I mentioned this before, but all of the American major networks, so that's ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox, and PBS, are available in Canada, and the affiliates are all in Buffalo and Western New York. So, we can watch local news from Buffalo if I turn on the Fox station or the PBS station or the CBS station. And I always remember the Fox station always would have closures of bus closures and snow days. And they had a lot more than we did. And of course, a snow day for us, a day when there was just too much snow, the buses couldn't run, was like the greatest a gift in the world, you know? And I always remember that, seeing the scroll being like Cheektowaga County, Tonawanda County, Seneca County, all these counties, all these district school boards are closed. And then sometimes we'd be like, oh, Mom, but they're closed in Buffalo, you know? They're closed to Buffalo, but they're not closed here. It was really funny. Yes, again, please hit that like button. Only around 50, okay, yeah, so for earlier, I was saying today was actually a little cold, it was around 40, and then it got towards 30, actually, and even under 30, even in the high 20s, low 30s in the night. So, it's getting quite chilly out here, which is why I've kind of been inside for a little while. But really, there's not too much going on. Other than, little errands here and there, nothing significant really since Wednesday. I'm still a little bit under the weather. I'm not really sure again if I'm really sick. Like it's sort of hard to say. I didn't really feel sick in London, but I definitely had a very dry throat. My voice, I kept it up until around the last, minute or two Wednesday, and I've got plenty of water. I got more than one of these bottles. So hopefully my voice will keep up and I'll talk like this so I won't enunciate too much. But I was coughing a lot, as you guys know. I had to stop and turn off my mic a few times. That's subsided, thankfully. A little stuffed up. So I don't know if it's allergies. I don't know if it's sinuses. I don't know if I've got a cold. I don't know what the heck is going on. But this week I am going to go see a doctor, which is free, thank God. We have universal healthcare here in Hungary. We also have a very decent and good private system. Not to gloat, I feel sorry for my American friends, but and any other people out there who might live in a country that doesn't have universal healthcare, it is a privilege and it is a blessing, I think, to some extent. And anywho, um, it's almost 10 after, so I think we'll get started with the presentation. But before I get into the presentation, I just want to say that this presentation, which I'm going to put up my slides now, it's around 50 degrees here too. Was hovering, yeah, it's about the same, I guess, anywhere The averages will be right now from Europe wide are like from 30 degrees to 50 Fahrenheit. So that's like, I guess that's like 0 to like 10, maybe 12. So that's about average. Well, let me put up my slides here for a second, and as I put them up, I'll just key in or weigh in rather to just say that because this is a big one. Oh, I hate when this happens. I'm sorry. You know what? I'm gonna fix this. I hate when I transfer to thing to from Google Slides. I really hate when that happens. Google Slides to what's it called, to PowerPoint, and it f's up my stuff like that. So let me just reapply this. It's not very, professional, and it's not my choosing, of course. It just happens. You can see here the N is all messed up, so I'm just gonna delete these from the studio. I'm gonna start again. So we'll start again of my presentation here, and I'll just add from my computer, and hopefully this will be better. Okay, so let's see. It's just processing, but basically, what I wanted to start off by saying is that this is a big event in world history and in European history. So it's possible I'm not going to hit every nail on the head. There will be things that obviously I have to leave out for time, but this is an overview. This PowerPoint presentation is, an introduction and an overview to this time in history, which I think is very, very interesting, and I hope that you all find it as interesting as I do. The other thing, no, it did it again. You see how the N there is separate, guys? Yeah, that really ticks me off, but okay, forgive me with that. That's something that I thought I fixed, but I did not. And I can't really do much now. It really, really stinks, but what are you going to do? So it should say, of course, 1848 Revolution and the Spring of Nations. So I'm here now at widescreen, so I won't be seeing the chat. But please, if you're in the chat, just ask some questions or make some comments, and I'll go back and forth every few slides. But this event is actually quite interesting. As I mentioned before, it wasn't something that I learned about when I, took history classes in Canada. I took world history and European history through high school. Um, I learned mostly about this when I studied, actually, mostly, I shouldn't even say studied, but when I lived in Berlin, when I was in Scientology, Germans are very knowledgeable of their own history, and I learned a lot about certain events. And one of these events was the 1848 revolution, which a lot of German people they know quite a bit about. And I had never really heard of this before. And so that was sort of the first time I encountered the 1848 revolution and the Spring of Nations, which didn't just affect Germany, which I will get into in a moment, but also affected a lot of different places in continental Europe, including Hungary, which again I will get into in a moment. Um, but I think it's a very fascinating, subject, and here we go. So the first step is what we have to sort of always look at some of the background of, why did the revolution happen and what was sort of the things going on even before 1848 in Europe that were so seminal. Right? And the first is, of course, is the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleonic Wars begin even before Napoleon, right? In 1789, starting with the French Revolution. There's a number, of course, of wars that go on there. There are in total 7 wars of the coalitions or coalition wars in Napoleon. The first 2 were part of the Revolution. Third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh is the totality of what's called the Napoleonic Wars, because of course Napoleon becomes the first consul, and then so on, becomes essentially the dictator of and monarch of France after the fact, and so forth. After I think it's like 1802, 1805, And a lot of numerous things that are very interesting and very seminal happen with that. I will again sum up this event, this time period. But the first thing is, of course, that in 1805, in December, there's a battle in Austerlitz, which is today near the city of Brno in the Czech Republic, in an area called Moravia, and the Holy Roman Empire, excuse me, uh, is defeated by France and Napoleon. And 1 year later, almost a year later, in August of 1806, the Holy Roman Empire is dissolved. And that's pretty impressive and pretty important considering the Holy Roman Empire began in the year 962, and it was started by Otto the Great. So that was around for about 844 years. So Napoleon was able to defeat that. Of course, we know Napoleon attacked Russia. We have the Battle of Leipzig, which is also called the Battle of Nations. There's a lot of interesting things. He is captured in 1813 and 14. He's sent to Elba. He escapes Elba. He goes to the last coalition, which is the Hundred Days' War, which ends, of course, in Waterloo. And what takes place in 1814 when Napoleon is in Elba, and then after in 1815, when he's exiled all the way down to St. Helena, which he only lives on that island for a few years. St. Helena, of course, is a deserted island that's several, I think, hundreds of kilometers from the coast of Angola in the South Atlantic Ocean. Is the map of Europe is redrawn, which is what happens at these congresses, and this is right after the Congress of Vienna. And you can see here how Europe is redrawn. I want to say one of the most interesting things, and I will get into a presentation at a future date of German unification, is that the Holy Roman Empire was mostly, of course, a German empire. Sometimes it's called the First Reich. Adolf Hitler used that term Third Reich. The First Reich, of course, according to him, was the Holy Roman Empire, 962 to 1806. The Second Reich would, of course, be the Imperial German Empire, 1871. That's the unified Germany that I'll get into later with Bismarck until 1918. And thank God his only lasted from, I guess what, 1934 until, until 1945, or 1933 to 1945, only 12 years. Half of it was at war. But if you look at these German states here, you'll notice that there's Prussia is quite large in this one. They're the dark green color. They have quite a few kingdoms on the west, but they're separated from the east and the north by a light green color that says the German states. These were called the Confederation of the Rhine. And I want to sort of look at these two just briefly here, because Napoleon was able to split the German people into two. So the areas that are in the light green, that again say German states, which was the Confederation of the Rhine, and Switzerland would fight the Napoleonic wars on the side of France and on the side of Napoleon. Whereas the dark green, Prussia, and the blue, the Austrian Empire, would continuously fight against Napoleon, siding with Russia, siding with Great Britain, and many other allies in the coalition wars. So in 1813, Germany itself was pretty scattered and fragmented. And you can see these purple lines that go all the way from the Netherlands down through France, over Switzerland, and today it's cut off by northern Italy. This is Austria, parts of Istria. If you guys remember Istria, we talked about that about a month or two ago. Slovenia, most of Austria, Bohemia, which again is in the Czech Republic, and Moravia, which I mentioned, Austerlitz, and then parts of today of northwestern and southwestern Poland. You can also see that there's areas outside of the German Confederation, such as the northeastern part of Prussia that's on the Baltic Sea, and also next to the Kingdom of Poland, and then of course northern Italy. So anyway, here this is Europe at 1815, and it's a really interesting place, but it's also very fragmented, and there's also a lot of feudalism that's involved. So let's look at some important figures if you want to, or two important figures that I want to talk about in the 1848 revolution, and they're both part of the Austrian Empire. So again, please understand there are more. Of course, there are definitely more important figures, some of which I'm going to talk about later. But these are two that I wanted to focus on due to their influence. So the first is when the revolutions began in the spring of 1848, which again is why, and specifically March of 1948, which is why we call it the Spring of Nations. The Emperor of Austria was this gentleman. His name was Ferdinand the First of Austria. He lived from 1793 and he died in 1875. This gentleman here was the oldest son of Francis II of the Holy Roman Empire, who later became Francis I of the Austrian Empire. This was the same person. Francis II of Holy Roman Empire and the Francis I of Austria are the same person. And he was the king or the emperor that lost at Austerlitz to Napoleon. And his mother was named Maria Theresa of Naples. Now, sad and sort of tragic thing about this gentleman was that his parents, the parents of Franz Ferdinand, were not only first cousins, but there was definitely a large line of inbreeding that happened during the Habsburg Empire, and Ferdinand the First was afflicted with many health issues through his life due to his parents' sort of inbredness or inbred relationship, which happened to a lot of the Habsburgs, and he sort of led, I think, a kind of a tragic life. The first is that he suffered from something called hydrocephalus, which is a cranial and neurological disorder. I don't know if you can kind of see it here, but you can also Google Ferdinand the First. He had a very misshapen cranium, so his head was very large, and it was very very abnormal, and he had a lot of disabilities because of that. Things that had to do with neurological disorders and so forth, including epilepsy, which he suffered from, and as well as speech issues. He had a lot of trouble speaking. He had impediments and so forth. So kind of a very, very tragic, I think, life for this gentleman. There's something that is kind of funny, but also isn't kind of funny that I learned when I went to the palace called Schönbrunn Palace, which I will get into in the next slide with the next gentleman. When I went there in 2018, which that Ferdinand had a lot of mood swings. I had a lot of mental health issues because of his conditions, and he would often wake his staff up in the middle of the night and shout, "I am the emperor and I want dumplings." So, very kind of irate, manic behavior and so forth. And he would demand all kinds of things like Chinese dumplings in the middle of the night and so forth, and would shout and get angry when his staff couldn't deliver it to him. The most important thing for us is although he was the emperor and the king of Austria and the emperor of Austria at the time in March of 1848, his reign lasted from the 2nd of March, 1835, until the 2nd of December of 1848. So that is, of course, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. So that's about what, 9 months of into the revolution, and mainly because of a lot of his inability to act upon what was going on due to some of his disabilities and so forth. Ferdinand resigned his throne, and in his place would be this gentleman, who is of course Franz Joseph, the first of Austria, who was born in 1830 and died in 1916. So I mentioned Schönbrunn Palace before. The Emperor Franz Joseph I was born there. He was born in Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna on the 18th of August, 1830. And he was the nephew of Franz Ferdinand I. So I can't remember if his father and I guess, someone else's were related somehow, but obviously he was I guess his father and Ferdy were related, or his mother and Ferdy were and Ferdinand was related, but regardless, he would actually take the throne at the age of 18. I mean, that's incredibly young, and he took it, right in the middle of the revolution, which is, quite impressive for an 18-year-old man, very young here, as we can say. If you Google him, also, he's also the emperor that had a very, very elaborate mustache, which I would love to grow one day. I can't, unfortunately, but I would love to have the emperor's mustache. So many of you probably have seen that, especially if you studied World War One history. Of course, you might see pictures of him. But almost immediately, Franz Joseph was, very much, I would say, a conservative. And in the empire, there were the Italians and the Hungarians who were trying to gain independence from Austria, and of course, he was opposed to this idea. He was opposed to having any more political leanings towards them. So, for example, new parliaments, new constitutions, voting rights. He was quite opposed to those things because he felt his empire, which he had just inherited, would break up, and so he kind of clamped down on these independence movements with an iron fist. He was, however, favored by the Austrian military during the time, even though he had a very young age. And it was said that he won a lot of key victories against the revolutionaries. He would later become very instrumental in the Austro Hungarian Compromise, which is sometimes called the Ausgleich, which was established in 1867 when the Kingdom of Hungary was able to get its own parliament, and we had the dual monarchy, and of course that lasted also till 1918. And Franz Ferdinand is now the second longest, but was the second longest reigning monarch in European history. He reigned for 67 years and 355 days. So just 10 days before he passed away, he would have been 68-year rule. And that was surpassed, I believe, just a few years ago by Queen Elizabeth II, who, of course, has now passed away. And I believe she reigned for 69, 70 years. So she outlived his reign, and he died pretty much in the middle of the First World War. Of course, the First World War was started in the summer of 1914, around July, and it ended in November, of course, of 1918. So here, roughly 2 years before the war ended, and 2.25 years after it started. So roughly, he died in the middle of the war. The next person was called Charles, and then the Emperor Charles, would take over until the empire dissolved, which officially dissolved by between 1918 and 1921. So it was very interesting. And so again, these different parallels between Ferdinand, who unfortunately was very weak as an emperor, and inherited it from his father, and wasn't really able to do much because of those disabilities. And then the younger, more virile, fertile, stronger Franz Josef, who would then go on to reign until the early 20th century, which I think is incredibly interesting. So the next would be looking at the causes. So, what were the causes of the 1848 revolution? And again, this is something that's very expansive. There's a lot of different causes, and I'm just giving you an example of a few of them here. So, some of the demands that the revolutionaries wanted to be fulfilled, and later I will show you a map of all the different areas in which in Europe in which there were revolutions. It wasn't just in Austria or Germany, but there were revolutions in France, there were revolutions in Romania, in Italy, and so forth. So a lot of different places in Western Central Europe. And what did they want? Well, at the time, there were these monarchs, Austria, France, Prussia, etc. And also in Italy, there were a number of monarchs, and a lot of them were kind of absolute monarchies. And they were not democratic, and they were not very liberal. So those who wanted the revolutions demanded more democratic rights and more liberalism. So that meant things like equality before the law, voting, and so forth. That was one of the biggest demands. Another one was reforming, if not completely overthrowing these, these European monarchs. So a lot of the revolutionaries did not like the monarchs at all. They wanted to again transform to liberal democracies, which had been happening. Obviously, with the French Revolution, the American Revolution was pretty big on those. So these many of the revolutionaries wanted that, and if, however, they weren't going to overthrow them, they at least wanted some kind of reform, which generally would go into what's called a constitutional monarchy rather than an absolute monarchy. The idea was to create nation states, which were founded by what they call romantic nationalist ideas. So between the 1820s and 30s, there was a philosophical movement called Romanticism. It's also something in painting and architecture and literature, but in this case, in political philosophy, those that were called Romantic nationalists believed that nationalism was something that predated the modern times. Now, today, we generally, as scholars, historians, believe that nationalism is a modern construct. So it was something that, would have taken place at least in the late modern era, so probably after the French Revolution. And most more specifically, probably around the 1800 early 1800s. So by the 1820s, there was this idea of pre-modern or primordial nations. And some examples of this is, in this time, the Polish nation was emerging, and a lot of them believed that they were descendants of a group of people called the Sarmatians. The Sarmatians were an Indo-Iranian people that had migrated from what today would be Iran, Persia, Crimea, etc. And they migrated into Poland, and the Polish people thought that they were their descendants. Same goes for both Albanians and Croatians who believed that they had descended from a group called the Illyrians, who were also a pre-Roman Balkan peoples who spoke an Illyrian language. We see the same in Romania with the Dacians. We see the same in North Macedonia and with today's North Macedonia, what's called Macedonian nationalism, believing that they are descendants of Alexander the Great. So normally what happened was, now there's some, of course, truth to this in that the Illyrians were in modern day Croatia and Albania. Alexander's Macedon Empire was in today's North Macedonia and so on. Romania had the Dacians, the Polish had the Sarmatians, etc. But this idea of pre-Roman times, there was a connection to a pre-Roman people groups, and this was becoming very, very important, and especially in Hungary, this is a lot of the idea that the Hungarians and the Huns, which many of you may have heard of, have some kind of, I guess, a kinship. Of course, we don't, but that was the idea, at least in Hungary and in other nations. That's what they were clinging on to. They were looking at these specifically pre-Roman, or in the case, of course, of the Huns, post-Roman tribes, normally from the east, or they were indigenous to whichever area they were from, like the Balkans, and they collapsed onto this idea that their people had always been there before these empires, especially Germany, Austria, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, etc. There was also a lot of dissatisfaction with political leaders. The revolutionaries demanded more participation in government for men or males, and especially males who were non-landowners, which is called universal male suffrage. It would then trickle down to Jews, religious minorities, and of course, we have to make note that women did not have, the right to vote in Europe until at least late 19th, early 20th century. So at the time, if someone was a male and a property owner, they had voting rights, or if they owned land, or if they owned a business or something. But universal male suffrage meant every man, every male could vote regardless of their economic status. But then again, it didn't mean Jews, it didn't mean Muslims in some cases, it didn't mean, certain minorities like women and etc. So, and of course maybe the non-educated and whatnot. So it did have this trickling down effect, let's say from around 1848 to like the 1920s, when now most countries in the world at least have women are allowed to vote. So I have to sort of put that there because being very specific here, it was about male non-landowners having the right to vote. The absolute monarchies, like in Prussia and so forth, they were not really known for having good freedom of press or freedom of speech and expression. So the revolutionaries not only demanded that, but they demanded that in writing within a constitution. So this is what I mean by constitutional rights. That also meant reforming or changing the system to become a constitutional monarchy. So therefore, the king himself, and the kings were all, always men and males. But the king would then have to live under this other law. It wasn't just the king's law. The king was essentially subjected to a sort of secular civic constitution. It also is noted here that there was an alliance of workers and reformers, and the upper and middle classes. They all temporarily united, at least for some time. But of course, those coalitions did not last long. And when we talked about Karl Marx a little while ago, this was also the year 1848 when Karl Marx put out his Communist Manifesto, which was a pamphlet. And he distributed that quite a bit to the revolutionaries, although the 1848 revolution was not a communist revolution, had nothing to do with that. This is when really excited Karl Marx, of course, because I mean, this was a revolution, and he said there would be one, and there was class conflict, which he also said, and then after that, he predicted the revolution that I guess still hasn't happened, but regardless. So if we take a look at Germany, this is what I mean by kind of feudalism, and this is a very interesting thing that happens. So remember, we go back to the one of the first slides is that in Germany, and actually let me just check to see if there's any messages. Okay, or comments. Okay, so in Germany, 1815, they become the German Confederation, and that lasts until 1866. And I'll go through what happens in 1864, 1866, and then 1871, which is called the Three Wars of German Unification, first, second, third. And I'll talk about that on another day. But this is the map of the German Confederation. So this is what Germany looks like following the Congress of Vienna. And in this confederation, there are 39 German-speaking sovereign states. This is very feudal. Okay, you can see the most interesting thing here is Prussia, because Prussia has this piece in the west that borders on the Netherlands, which is quite large, and then it has a piece in the east that is bordering on Austria, today's Poland, and the Baltic Sea. There's also Austria is quite large here. Bavaria next to it, which has a couple. It actually has another spot. Bavaria has. Um, it's kind of hard to see, but it borders on France. So these are very odd things that if you really want to know more, I would just Google the map of the German Confederation, and you can see like enclaves. So like if it would be almost like you have a county and then like one field of a farmer in a county belongs to someone else, and then another farm in another county belongs to someone else, but the bigger picture, the bigger county is all a part of another county. So within a circle you've got two circles inside, and they have three different things. And you'll notice that between Prussia and specifically between Prussia and Bavaria, where there's Saxony, which is around where the city of Dresden is, and Leipzig. This is called Upper Saxony, and there's like at least a dozen of these like enclaves and enclaves. It's really really strange. However, um, one of the events that happened in 1848 was that Germany lost a war against Denmark, and they lost an area called Schleswig-Holstein, and that Schleswig-Holstein is right in the upper center of our map. It's in the light green. It borders on Denmark, and you can kind of see it up there. Just if we go straight to the map, it's like again, it's a dark green color. And they also lost the city of Hamburg, and that would go to the hands of Denmark from 1848 to 1864. So that was, pretty tough on the Germans, and that inspired Bismarck, and actually in 1864, to retake that land. But as far as the revolutions were concerned, there were, fairly numerous around the German Confederation. So the city of Baden, which was the capital city of the Kingdom of Baden, Frankfurt is where the German Confederation had its parliament. I also want to note that um, the Emperor of Austria was also the president, I guess you could say, of the German Confederation. Munich, of course, was the capital of the Kingdom of Bavaria. Vienna is the capital of Austria. Berlin was the capital of Prussia, and Prague was the capital of Bohemia. Not only were there kingdoms like Prussia, Baden, Württemberg, Bavaria, and Austria, but there were also a lot of duchies and grand duchies, which again emphasizes this sort of feudalism. So, while they all were sort of united under this Frankfurt Parliament, and the head of that was the Austrian emperor, they certainly had a lot of scattered kind of feudalistic, organization. Um, after this, After this, we've got Italy, which again I'm going to do. I'll do another presentation about in a future date. Italy has less states going on. It's not in a confederation, first of all. What we know today as Italy, which was united in 1870 and then onwards, was at this time split into seven ununified states. So it wasn't even unified under a confederation. They were just different states. This included Piedmont, Sardinia, which you can see on this map. Piedmont is in the direct upper left corner. It's in like a dark orange color. And then if you follow that down, there are two islands, the lower island of Sardinia, which is in the same color, that orange color. This was the Kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia. And this would be very important for later Italian unification in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, including a gentleman named Giuseppe Garibaldi, which I will talk about in the future. There was also Parma. If you look at where Sardinia is and you look a little bit toward the right, you can see green, which is all Austria at the top. You'll see a purple color that's kind of wedged between a yellow color in the north. That's Parma. Modena is that yellow color. Down from that yellow color is the bright green color, which is Tuscany. Right next to that is the pink color, which is the Papal States, and all of southern Italy, Naples, Calabria, and the island of Sicily is the Kingdom of Sicily. So the revolutions would then take place in three different cities, including Palermo in Sicily, Milan, which as the time Lombardy was part of course, of Austria, and also Rome, which was part of the Papal States. And unlike the German War of Unification, the first unification in Germany, their war happened in 1864. 1848 was actually the year of the First War of Italian unification. And it would take place between Milan, San Marco, which were two what they called them insurgent states, as well as Rome and Sardinia. And they would fight against Austria, Sicily, the Papal States, and Tuscany, which again goes back to that kind of thing that Napoleon did, where because Italy was not united, Austria and some pretty powerful Italian states went after Milan, San Marco, Rome, Sardinia, which were smaller at the time, states, and so they were not unified. And of course, Austria had a hand in this. And so one of the reasons for uniting was so all of the Italian states would be able to fight as one. And the results of the First War was that the revolutions failed in Italy. Some insurgent states, again, like Milan or San Marco and so forth, they did obtain liberal constitutions, but they were soon abolished, with the exception to that of the Kingdom of Sardinia. And again, I'll get into Sardinia, Garibaldi, and sort of what went on with him at a future date. Next is that the revolution itself is a very big here in Budapest. I'm not really sure because I don't know how many, for example, holidays there are that commemorate the 1848 revolution, but um, the 15th of March every year is a national holiday, which we call the 1848 Revolution Day, and it commemorates what took place in Budapest. So in Budapest, our 1848 revolution took place between the 15th of March, 1848, and the 4th of October, 1849. This event is considered to be a national awakening for the Hungarian people. It is when Hungarian nationalism starts to go more into effect. It's also when the after this point that Hungarian itself starts to become more of the official language. It replaces German in a lot of cases, not in every case. It would take some time to, but a lot of people, for example, spoke German, might not have spoken Hungarian, so Hungarian crept its way there. One interesting fact is that in April of 1848, Hungary actually established its own parliament, which was against the advice of Austria, and they held democratic elections in that parliament. These were referred to as the April Laws. However, they were effectively taken away and eventually taken away by Austria, so by Franz Joseph I. We have a gentleman named Lajos Bátány, and he was elected. So his government, for example, fell after several interventions by Austria. They closed down the Hungarian parliament. I do want to say that in 1867, as I mentioned earlier, with the compromise, Hungary would eventually get its own separate parliament under the Kingdom of Hungary, which was in the dual monarchy. But in 1848, in April, this was suppressed. Now, the revolutions continued throughout 1848 and into 1849. Austria itself was dealing with a lot of internal conflicts, as I mentioned, in Italy, for example, and in Hungary. And so it was on the verge of collapse when the Austrians called in and made an alliance with the Russians, called in the Russians, and in 1848 and 49, they roughly occupied Hungary for roughly a year, maybe give or take a few months on each end. And that was essentially to calm everybody down. And there were Russian troops, Tsarist troops all around here in Budapest to just keep everyone down. And then, of course, 1867, the compromise happens anyway. This photo that's here is a photo of the Hungarian National Museum, which you can see if you come to Budapest. It's at a place called Calvin Tér or Calvin Tér, Calvin Square, named for John Calvin or Jean Calvin, the Reformed Christian theologian who's the founder of the Reformed Church and the Presbyterian Church. And there was a man named Sándor Petőfi, who was a poet, and he would deliver what was called the National Song, which is a poem on the steps of this museum back then. And again, every 15th of March, there's a commemoration, political figures, celebrities here in Budapest and so forth go back to the museum, and there's usually a celebration. And it's very interesting. So again, I think this is one of the few places, or at least a few countries, where the 1848 revolution is not just known in many cases, but is celebrated. Although I could be wrong about that. I don't know about Prague. I don't know about other places. I'm not sure. Maybe the Czechs have a national holiday that commemorates 1848, because again, Prague did have their own revolution. So please let me know if you know anything about that. So here's the wider end view, the larger view of all the different places that had revolutions. And it's pretty wide. It's mostly again in continental Europe. So Paris is the most west. I would say up there, it's called Yash, which is the most east, and then Berlin, the most north, and Palermo as the most south. But we see here it's got Berlin, Frankfurt, Paris, Munich, Vienna, Prague, Budapest, Krakow, Warsaw, Bucharest, Rome, and Palermo. Plus, again, all these other places where there would have been, some kind of conflict and so forth. So it's quite a lot. It's over 20, and it was definitely something that was quite interesting. And as I said, I never really knew about this until not that long ago. And when I was an undergrad in Canada, I took a class on Europe between 1815 and 1914, and we did talk about this. We did like there was a lecture about this and its impact, and we did some readings about nationalism. So it was very impactful and it was very interesting. It was very nice. After this, I do want to say if anyone is interested in reading anything about 1848. I found this as an undergrad in the library, and this is 1848 Year of Revolution by Mike Rappaport, and it's a very very good book. It's a good place to start your research on 1848 Revolution. So that does it for my presentation. I hope everyone found that to be very interesting. We didn't have that many people on right now. We just had about two or three people at most, and usually my Saturdays do get upwards of at least 5 or 10. So it could happen where people are, just out. I know in the United States, it's a busy holiday and things like this, but I just wanted to thank everyone who chimed in. Thank you so much to Pete, to Chad, of course, and to Irish Mart. Thank you all. I'm not going to just end right now. I'm going to just go through some final thoughts and stuff, but I do appreciate it. Anyway, if anyone has any questions, if anyone has any, any thoughts or whatever, please type them in. But one of the things that I do as a historian is I look at nationalism. Oh, thank you, by the way. Thank you so much, Irish. Yeah, thank you so much. I hope so. Yeah, just type 1848 revolution. You can probably go to your library and find a lot of books. I know in Ireland they'd have a ton of it because a lot of scholars in the UK and in Ireland have been writing a lot in English. So, like Mike Rappaport's book will be, easily available. Thank you, Clearwater Chat. I appreciate both of you. But yeah, just to sort of conclude, is I'm sort of I guess the first thing that I did that I ever latched onto, being a late modern historian, one of the of late modern Europe, right? So now I'm mostly focused in my thesis on doing, things about Jewish social life and political life in like the late 19th century to World War One. But my first thing that I gravitated towards was was the history of European nationalism, nation state building, which does take place at least from the French Revolution, which is designed as nationalism was designed. I know it has a very a negative connotation today, and of course, there's a lot of reasons for that. But the idea of nationalism was that it took us out of feudalism, and feudalism was that idea that an individual had to sort of swear allegiance and pay taxes to a lot of crooked barons and landlords, lords, barons, dukes, grand dukes, and there'd be a lot of them, and there was a lot of peasantry and so forth. And so, as liberalism itself evolved through the 18th and 19th centuries, um, these revolutions, and again, I understand, you know, one of the things about the American Revolution is it didn't end slavery, which is tragic and horrible. One of the things about, the 1848 revolution is it didn't give everyone the right to vote. But let's just say it was a start. I don't know. It's not an excuse, but at least it was an intention to start to give some people more rights than they had before. And I think, of course, it would have been better if more people had gotten rights based on their race or their religion or their sex and gender. But at least in that point, people were starting to outgrow some of what's called the absolutism and the neo-absolutism of people like Franz Joseph, who clung on to that old way of thinking until he died, and was one of the many reasons why World War One happened, because he was the one who annexed Bosnia, and things like this. And And so the idea of just giving more people rights and the rights to sort of define themselves and give what we would call self-preservation and self-determination. And so today, nationalism is mainly known for being a very far right wing ideology, but it started as a very liberal upper class ideology. It started in not just the Jewish world later with Zionism, but also in the Christian world specifically, starting in the early 1800s. It was also secular in many ways. And so it's one of these things that has evolved. And I do want to say, too, it's often seen sometimes as an oxymoron to talk about left wing nationalism, but many people like myself, many historians of nationalism like myself, will argue that many left wing people established, nation states like Cuba. Castro could be said to be a Cuban nationalist. Stalin could be said to be at least a Soviet nationalist. And one of the most interesting figures who was also, a communist and a radical Marxist in many ways was Ho Chi Minh. And if you know anything about the Vietnam War, and especially if you, and I recommend this, is to watch the Vietnam War documentary series from Ken Burns on PBS. There's always been a question on whether or not someone like Ho Chi Minh was more of a Marxist or communist or a Vietnamese nationalist, which in like ideologically speaking, it is, it's an oxymoron, it's a contradiction. And yet, Ho Chi Minh was, a pretty hardcore Vietnamese nationalist. So we often associate contemporarily of putting nationalism on right wing and right wing, spectrum of the political spectrum, but it isn't. And there's also many different types of nationalism, which I think I'll get into, in the next coming weeks before the break. So yeah, so thanks everybody. This was my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it interesting. I will put up a poll either later today or tomorrow on what we're going to talk about next Wednesday. But I will be back the same time, which is 12, of course, p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. in the UK. And then next week on Saturday, I'm going to do something where I'm breaking down different political philosophies. I'm not sure exactly which one I'll do yet. I'm thinking we've got liberalism, conservatism. I might do those two in one presentation, and then I was thinking of doing something else like maybe socialism and capitalism and the week after. So to just break down and say like here are the different types, the different parts, who are the people that are important, and I'll do a pretty basic PowerPoint, but I'll do something like a PowerPoint. So again, thank you very much. I hope everyone has had and will have a wonderful weekend. And in case I don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.